Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our session. I am Yves de Koning. I'm a professor at Laval University in Quebec City, and I'm also chairing an initiative that's called the Canadian Brain Research Strategy. And we propose to have this panel today with the list of panel members that you see on your screen to discuss the question of whether Canada should have its own brain initiative, something that a group of scientists have been uh, working on and discussing and joining with a broad number of stakeholders across the country. So for this panel, I'll be chairing this panel, and we have four invited speakers that will discuss different coming to this question from different perspective. We have Diana Grutzinger, who's representing the Neurological Health Charities Canada, the patient perspective on this. We have Jan Biara, who's uh, chairing the International Brain Initiative, which will give us a global perspective on that. We have Jason Mattingly, who's coming from Australia, who will tell us Australia, a country that is, has a lot of to share with us and their process and their thoughts process through their own brain initiative, and and Shahnaz Bamji also at the end, who is the currently she's professor at the University of British Columbia, but also currently the president of the Canadian Association for Neuroscience, and she will give us also her perspective on where do we situate ourselves on the international scene, Canada, in this whole field of brain research. So if we go to the next slide, before our speakers talk, I just want to say a brief overview of what this Canadian Brain Research Strategy is. This is basically a community of researchers and growing number of stakeholders getting together to say with building a consensus around the idea that we really need Canada is very well positioned, is a real powerhouse in the field of neuroscience, as you'll see today, and we should try to shape our vision around what a brain initiative in Canada should be. So you see that it's bringing leaders from a very broad number of institutes across the country, from coast to coast, all the major neuroscience institutes and programs in universities across the country, but there's also the Canadian Association for Neuroscience around the table, Neurological Health Charities, as I mentioned earlier. We also have an Indigenous knowledge holder group and a growing number of stakeholders, as I said before, that are taking part in this. If we go to the next slide, it outlines basically the vision and mission that we've spelled out among ourselves to really try to innovate and build on collaborative brain science to drive not just science, but actually drive the ambition is really to be able to drive at several levels, at policy level, at the social health level, and economic advancement, because the field of neuroscience is very important in terms of the burden of disease. We'll see this, but also as a major source of economic development. So again, building on Canada's strength, major strength, as you'll see, to really transform the neurological and mental health for Canadians. And this group of people is not trying to seek money for itself. It's really acting as a group that want to inspire government to invest into a major brain initiative, but through whatever channel government would seek pertinent to do that, akin to some other countries have done, like the US, where they have channeled the money through their conventional channels. And one of the real major drive behind this is really there's what to do, but especially how to do it. And we really think that Canada can be a role model on the world scene in how we conduct research, the approach to research, especially focusing on bringing people in a collaborative and mobilize everyone around a common voice. So if we go to the next slide, something that emerges a lot in this context of how something that's very Canadian, where we distinguish ourselves, is a real collaborative culture in the country. Transdisciplinarity is something that is really bringing a lot of consensus. The field of neuroscience spans everything from cell biology all the way to society, how we interact with each other, and is a major dialogue with the technology sector as well. So we really need a lot of transdisciplinarity in this area. And open, it is particularly an important effort to do in the field of neuroscience towards open science. So if you go to the next slide, one of the activities that this collective is also driving is around what we've identified as 6 task force or transformative initiatives to really try to position the ecosystem, the Canadian ecosystem, and where we can make a real difference again in these areas. Open science, transdisciplinary training, increasing capacity with transdisciplinary training, the neuroscience, artificial intelligence interface, a very natural interface where there's an enormous that can be gained from the field of artificial intelligence to advance neuroscience, but also neuroscience as a major driver for the development of artificial intelligence. Diversity in team science is particularly important, again, for the field of neuroscience because it goes from biology, as I said, to society and how we interact with each other. Very important. Neuroethics as a fundamental backbone of all of these efforts. Really translate science and dialogue and dialogue to society, and also platform science, a model of research that we think is very important to foster a collaboration, transdisciplinarity, and open science. So if we move forward, you can see the next few bullet points, one after the other, keep moving on. We're bringing together representation. We think that Canada can be a real role model on that, and it has the potential to really transform neuroscience and mental health for Canadians and on the international scene. As I said again, because the field of brain research and neuroscience bridges through probably the highest, the broadest range of scales of complexity, from how cells function all the way to society. And the next slide is so this is the introduction for the Canadian Brain Research Strategy, and we'll have each of our speakers giving their perspective. So I pass the microphone to Diana Gritzinger from Neurological Health Strategy Canada. Neurological Health Charity Canada.
Thanks very much, Yves. I'm really happy to be here today on behalf of Neurological Health Charities Canada. Next slide, please. So in setting the stage for this discussion, I want to emphasize the importance of brain health. And not only is brain health critical to the millions of Canadians on a very personal level, but it also severely impacts the Canadian. I think is there another, there's more to this slide. If we could bring up the rest of it, I hope. There we go. Thanks very much. So a 2016 CIHR report stated that neurological and mental health cost the Canadian economy $61 billion annually. And that's more than cancer and cardiovascular disease combined. Other points to take into consideration: that neurological conditions are leading causes of severe disability along the entire lifespan from birth to later on in age. Working age Canadians with neurological conditions are 5 times more likely to be permanently unemployed than Canadians without brain conditions. And finally, between now and 2031, indirect costs due to working age premature death and disability will increase, and total healthcare costs for Parkinson's disease and dementia. Next slide, please. Points that I mentioned on the previous slide are from Mapping Connections, 14 report of the National Population Health Study Conditions. If we can bring up the rest of the slide, please. CSPC came together as a coalition of neurological health charities in 2008 to push for a comprehensive study. So at the time, we gathered in a room and we said, what do we know about our respective conditions and what we don't know? And what we didn't know far outnumbered what we did know. So we convinced the government to invest $15 million in a 4-year study, and then helped lead the study in a unique collaboration with federal government agencies and departments. Our role then, as it is today, was to help represent the voice of people with lived experience and to assist them to be at decision-making tables. Today, NHC that important work and to start closing the knowledge gaps that were identified in Mapping Connections. We are proposing the National Neurological Canada to allow all Canadians to maximize brain health. Identified 6 critical areas that we think should be included in a national neurological strategy. The point at the bottom slide, actually the next, please. Yes, thank you. The key among them is fostering strategic approaches to research into neurological conditions. NHCC is proud to be a partner of the Canadian Brain Research Strategy and to work with the team to build a research strategy that would complement and fit in really nicely with an overall national neurological strategy. Next slide, please. So we believe that now is the time for action. Interestingly, the United Nations and World Health Organization have recognized that brain health, both neurological and mental health, is a pressing issue that all countries must address. In 2018, the United Nations identified neurology as a priority area, resulting in WHO creating a dedicated brain health unit. However, only 24% of countries worldwide have standalone neurological health policies. Canada is not, despite being a high-income country. According to WHO, most of the countries' standalone neurological health policies are low to middle-income countries. Canada should address this anomaly as soon as possible by taking a number of steps, including, we believe, the creation of a Canadian Brain Research Initiative. Thank you, and I will now turn it over to the next speaker.
We're turning the microphone to Jan Bjarre, who's, as I said before, professor in the University of Oslo, but also the current chair of the International Brain Initiative Strategy Committee. Jan?
Okay, thank you very much. So is the sound on the camera working? That's good.
Yes.
Pleasure to be here. So I would like to give a few comments to the International Brain Initiative, and we'll begin by taking a look at what is a brain initiative. On the next slide, please. So here we have 3 categories, as you can see. A brain initiative can be a particularly large project. The European Human Brain Project, as I'm representing, is such an example. It could be a portfolio of projects under one umbrella. That would be, for example, the US Brain Initiative falls into that category. Or it could be a systematic startup action, and I believe that's what we are discussing at the moment with the Canadian initiative. The three logos at the bottom are the first that occurred in 2013 and the year after, including also the Japan Brain Mines. So let's take a look at these 7 initiatives in the next slide, please. So here they are around the globe, so to speak, beginning from the left with the Canadian Brain Research Strategy, US Brain Initiative, moving over the Atlantic to the EU Human Brain Project, and then further east, China Brain Project, Japan Brain Mines, Korea Brain Initiative, and the Australian Brain Alliance that we have with us also in this meeting today. So here the text shows the so-called Canberra Declaration, which was created in December 2017. This defines the initiatives. What they say together is that global brain initiatives, they recognize that they're engaged in an effort so large and complex that even with unprecedented efforts and resources from public and private sectors, no single initiative can really deal with the fundamental challenges. And there are quite a few challenges related to understanding the brain in health and disease of tremendous importance for societies. This is the starting point, but these 7 initiatives are, of course, not alone. So we can take a look at the next slide. And here we have an emphasis on the fact that the participating initiatives are working together with a network of funders, funding partners, and stakeholders. You can see to the right a number of logos representing different funders that are participating in the IBI, and also a number of organizations, for example, societies and other organizations working in the brain area. We also have with us in the stakeholder board, or the stakeholder collective, as we say, the Cuba Brain Project, Brain Research Africa, Brain Initiative New Zealand, and Latin American Brain Initiative. I'd like to point also to the importance of the working groups we have at the IBI with representatives from the initiatives. These working groups are focusing on topics such as education and training, tools and technologies dissemination, neuroethics, data standards and sharing, and also within that domain areas such as international data governance, which is a key aspect since international collaboration requires that we are sharing and moving data across the world to really pull together the information we need and reach critical mass for a number of achievements in the future. So we can take a look at the next slide, and that emphasizes the role of the IBI in communicating at different levels. I'd like to point to a particular event that took place at the European Parliament mid-October this year, where we are invited by the Scientific Foresight Unit of the Parliament. And they had a 2-hour workshop with us where we discussed a number of topics and had actually great responses from the Parliament in terms of this. It resulted also in an editorial in the journal Lancet Neurology and an article summarizing these discussions. As you can see, the authors here includes also from Canada, Yves de Koninck. And the statement to the right there is from the end of the article. I think it captures several important points for us to have in mind, and that is that neuroscience, the brain research field, is a field that is not really homogeneous. It has a number of different disciplines, an alliance of different disciplines. So being interested in brain and brain research means that you really reach out to many, many researcher communities. It's really bringing people together. And the IBI as an organization will strive to bring about an extraordinary collaborative effort that is so critical in this field to make scientific advance and to inspire new methods. So this is also a driver for technology development, influencing way of thinking, and of course has a huge potential impact in the health area since there are so many unresolved questions in the brain area. So we're really looking forward to the participation of Canada, strong participation of Canada in the future into this joint exciting venture. So thanks very much. That's my comments today.
We're now turning to Jason Mattingly from Austria to tell us about the Australian Brain Alliance efforts.
Well, thank you very much, Eve, and good morning from Australia to everyone. So I'm the co-chair of the Australian Brain Alliance, which represents more than 30 different research institutions, universities, and neurotechnology companies across Australia. The ABA was established in 2016, and that was originally under the auspices of the Australian Academy of Science. And it grew out of discussions between scientists within the Academy of the need for a coordinated national approach to neuroscience research and translation. Australia has a reputation for excellence in brain research, but it hasn't really had a peak body to represent its interests nationally or internationally. So the broad aims of the ABA are to promote Australia's neuroscience capabilities, to identify opportunities for the development of brain-inspired technologies, and to support the translation of brain science discoveries into all areas of society, from education all the way through to things like health and medicine. So next slide, please. So a central goal of the ABA is to secure government funding for what we call an Australian Brain Initiative. And the idea behind that is to bring together Australia's brain scientists and key stakeholders in industry, from government, in education, and the health sector more broadly. And we've outlined our detailed plans for an Australian Brain Initiative in a set of published papers and policy documents, some of which you see on this slide. If you look at the circular figure on the left-hand side, it just gives an overview of the structure of our proposed initiative. So right at the very center, we have what we call our grand scientific challenges, which are built around the concept of cracking the brain's code, our kind of mission statement. And these challenges will shape our priority research areas. And around these, we aim to build a set of incubators, so those yellow arrows that you see, to bring together scientists and stakeholders. And these will focus on the development of a range of enabling technologies and different kinds of interventions. And the ultimate goal is to create a set of new brain-inspired industries, to create new health applications, and also new approaches to education across the lifespan from preschool years all the way up to older age. Next slide, please. So in addition to our long-term goal of securing government support for a coordinated national brain initiative, the ABA has also engaged in a number of other important sort of near-term activities. We've established a national network for early and mid-career brain scientists. Of course, these are the people who are going to be the thought leaders of the future in our country. We've also established a neuroethics working group whose goal is to assist government and regulatory bodies to develop an evidence-based socially responsible set of policies in the neurotech area. And we have a data working group as well, whose goal is to develop hardware and software so that data from brain science can be shared widely across academia and industry, both within our own country in Australia, but also internationally. A key element in our strategy to fund an Australian Brain Initiative was to commission an independent business case, a strategic business case, which you see on the right-hand side of the slide up the top there. This report was released in March in 2020, and it highlights the potential global market for neurodevices and neurodiagnostics, which currently stands at something like $36 billion per annum. And it has a projected growth rate of 6 to 8% per year. And we found that the strategic business case has really helped our leaders in government to see the enormous potential and the enormous potential return on investment that will flow from supporting an Australian Brain Initiative. And so ABA representatives have twice visited our nation's capital in Canberra to showcase brain science and to talk to our senators and our members of parliament. And this is an event we call Brains on the Hill, which you see down in the lower right-hand side of that slide. And if we move on to the next slide, These are just some photos from a recent event at our Parliament House. We've had one-on-one meetings with MPs. We've given talks to a group called the Parliamentary Friends of Science. And we've raised awareness of our activities by having all of the cafes and the restaurants in Parliament replacing their usual coffee cups and their napkins with versions that carry our logo and our mission statement. You can see there, Crack the Brains code on a coffee cup. Next slide, please. So when politicians and members of the public think about neuroscience, they usually think about brain diseases like dementia, like stroke and epilepsy. And in the ABA, we're trying to raise awareness of some of the incredible technologies that have arisen from basic science discoveries, which are now helping to improve people's lives. And on this final slide, I've just highlighted 3 of these innovations that have been developed in Australia. On the left-hand side is a spinal cord implant that monitors nerve activity in patients with chronic back pain and delivers tailored relief through a targeted kind of electrical stimulation. In the middle, neuromorphic engineering of sensors and algorithms and hardware platforms that function like the eye or the brain, and which can be used to support neural prosthetics. And then finally, on the right-hand side, there's an example of a minimally invasive neural diagnostic event recorder, which can detect epileptic seizures before they occur, and it can refine different treatments. So just in conclusion, we in the ABA believe that the establishment of a coordinated national strategy to support brain science will enable the development of many more such devices for the benefit of all Australians. And thank you again for the invitation to participate in this exciting panel.
Thank you. And we're closing with Shahnaz Bamji, Professor at the University of British Columbia, but also the President of the Canadian Association for Neuroscience, for positioning Canada on the world scene there.
So as Eve mentioned, that I am actually representing the Canadian Association for Neuroscience, or CAN, which is composed of over 1,000 researchers working at academic institutions across. So while the BRAIN Initiative provides an overarching vision and strategy for neuroscience research in Canada, CAN is a professional society. So our general mission is to support and promote neuroscience research in Canada and to represent the interests of Canadian neuroscientists at the national and international levels. So we do this through 4 main activities, through the organization of meetings, through our efforts to increase equity, diversity, and inclusion in neuroscience research, through our advocacy efforts to increase funding for foundational research, and through our partnerships. We have a number of partnerships with Japan, British, and French neuroscience societies. So my role on this panel is to really provide you with the lay of the land with respect to neuroscience research in Canada. Next slide, please. So the first thing that I'll say is that Canadian neuroscientists really punch above their weight on the international scene. So what you're looking at here is the outcome of an independent study commissioned by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research's Institutes of Neuroscience, Mental Health, and Addiction. And it's a graph demonstrating that Canadians rank amongst the most productive in the world in the field of neuroscience. So the size of each one of these circles reflects the number of neuroscience articles published by each country. So Canada publishes about the same number of papers per capita as many other countries. Now the x-axis depicts how many times these studies are cited, and it's one measure of the quality of the science. And the fact that Canada is at the top end of this graph demonstrates really how well we do with respect to this metric. And the x-axis is the specialization index. And the fact that Canada is located to the extreme right of the chart shows that Canadians specialize in neuroscience more than any other research areas and more than any other country. So altogether, the study has demonstrated that Canadian neuroscience research ranks in the top 4 in the world. And we think that these results are even more remarkable when you consider the fact that amongst the 20 most active countries in neuroscience, Canada only ranks 11th in terms of spending on research and development, which is measured as a percentage of GDP, and only 9th in terms of the number of researchers in the workforce. So next slide, please. So not only are we really strong in neuroscience research, but Canada is particularly well positioned to be a leader in conducting open, collaborative, transdisciplinary, and ethical research. So what you're seeing here are the organizations that foster this kind of highly collaborative science, and it features Canadian neuroscience. And this includes government programs at a national level, such as the Networks of Centers of Excellence of Canada, or NCE, and the Canadian Consortium on Neurodegeneration in Aging. But we also have a number of government programs at the international level, and I'd like to highlight two examples. So the first is CFAR, or the Canadian Institutes for Advanced Research, which is a Canada-based global research organization focusing on bringing together the world's best scholars and scientists to address some of the most pressing research questions. Now, 3 out of the 12 CFAR programs, and these programs can span questions from microbes to energy to space. So 3 out of these 12 programs are related to brain, which is a really significant weighting for neuroscience. And the second is ERA Net Neuron, which is a network of European funding for neuroscience research. Now, it's composed of 27 research funding organizations from 23 countries, and its mission is to support basic clinical and translational research on the brain and brain diseases. And Canada happens to be one of the few non-European countries included in this network, which I think once again highlights the fact that we are a global leader in neuroscience and we are used to engaging in collaborative research. So there are many more examples that I won't go through, but the takeaway message is that the Canadian research ecosystem is highly collaborative, and that a Canadian Brain Initiative will really fit well into this ecosystem. And these statistics were provided, sorry. So the next slide, please. And so finally, I want to say that the Canadian Brain Initiative fits well with Canada's model for research. So the Canada Research Coordinating Committee, or CRCC, was established in October 2017 to revitalize the federal research funding system in Canada and to better meet the needs of Canadian researchers. And it's made up of the heads of the major funding agencies in Canada. And they have identified 5 national priorities, which I won't read out, but it's clear that a quick glance through demonstrates a really good alignment between the Canadian Brain Initiative and the spirit and vision for research in Canada. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for this overview. We're going to be addressing questions in the Q&A if people have questions that they want to address to the speakers. But maybe I can start with a few of them just to feed in the discussion. And I guess an initial one is perhaps the obvious one is, again, I mean, you've given some elements already, but why should Canada have its own brain initiative? A small country like Canada, there are much larger countries, much larger entities like the Americans and the European the initiative. But where do you think? Yeah, why Canada and why brain initiative? If someone wants to address some of this question, maybe we can start with the Canadians around the table.
I can start this off. Perhaps I think that Canada, as I just mentioned, I think that we do extraordinarily well in terms of neuroscience. So we have a lot of extraordinarily good Canadian neuroscientists. And we are our own entity. We are not America. We're not the Society for Neuroscience. We have our own Canadian association, our own organization. We participate really well on the world stage when it comes to neuroscience. And I think it's time that we have our own brain initiative so that we can also sit around the table on the international, brain initiative stage to talk about our own, what we can bring to the table.
possibly add to that, in Australia, you know, we're in a very similar situation in terms of population size, possibly also investment in science. And one of the things that has been in our minds within the Australian Brain Alliance is that, you know, we have, for one thing, we have quite a unique population. You know, we have an Indigenous community in Australia. We're a very multicultural society. I know Canada is also a very multicultural society. And so many of the considerations in how new knowledge that gets developed from brain science is then rolled out into society is very much determined by the nature of that society, the makeup of that society. And so we felt in Australia we had some unique challenges that we wanted to be able to contribute to, and we felt that having a coordinated national strategy would really help with that. From a more sort of purely sort of pragmatic point of view as well, you know, neuroscience, as I mentioned in my presentation, is supporting the development of many, many new technologies, spin-off companies, intellectual property, and so on. And I think if individual countries want to be part of that sort of new wave of innovation and get the financial and societal benefits, then they need to be developing those technologies in their own countries. Of course, we can bring in technologies, we can bring in intellectual property from our neighbors, but of course we do that at our own expense to some extent. And I think that in Australia, our idea is that we want to be the innovators and that we want to reap the rewards for the public more generally of the development of intellectual property, the development of devices locally to support manufacturing industries and so on. So they're just two reasons why in Australia we thought that it was important to have our own sort of coordinated national strategy.
I might give an additional comment. I think it's very clear that Canada has critical mass. Canada has very strong research environments. And creating a brain initiative in Canada creates some kind of convergence and focus, which I think you will benefit from tremendously. It is an opportunity to really bring together national level you have and connect internationally even stronger than what's happening today. I think that is needed from an outside perspective, and it is something I think would be of great benefit for Canada as we see it around the world. And as Jason explains the Australian perspective, it was also some of these arguments were also the reasons for the priorities we saw when the US Brain Initiative were formed and when things happened on the European side and so on. So it's clearly a wave that is now worthwhile.
Maybe I can push you more, Jan, as to, with respect to within the IBI, in the context of IBI, how you see, you know, you have this consortium of several initiatives. They have different geometries, different scales. So how, maybe perhaps you can say how we see how Canada can contribute to that. If you're comparing Canada to the large-scale European Brain Project or the large-scale US Brain Initiative, and well, based on your experience within IBI, how you've seen this play out. Whoops, you're muted.
Sorry about that. That was the wrong button. So I would say that based on what we already heard today, it is very clear that Canada has many of the components that you really need for a strong brain initiative. This is very clear. You have laboratories that cover a broad range of methods. You have infrastructure developers, and you cover almost all fields of science. So I think that makes Canada, as we already heard, clearly visible on the map. So to me, it's more about making sure that you really can benefit from that and make it stronger and make sure you can create additional values. That's my perspective on this.
Maybe we can have a word from the patient perspective, Diana. I mean, again, why?
Yes, I was actually going to.
Why a special Canadian focus for the patients? Yeah.
Right. No, I was actually going to leap in. So thank you. Yeah. I think the one thing I've been really quite impressed with the brain research strategy approach, and to think very much from the very beginning about how people with lived experience, patients, can and should be involved. And that's certainly something that NHCC is we bring to that, and we're very conscious of. I mentioned the National Population Health Study of Neurological Conditions, which we push for, and then we're able, through a rather unique arrangement with the federal government at the time, while the money flowed through the Public Health Agency of Canada, we co-managed with Public Health Agency, Health Canada, and HR. So what we were able to bring to that work were our connections with member organizations, and more importantly, with all the people who are living with neurological conditions. And so if memory serves, I think there were originally 14 separate projects plus the microstimulation. But we were able to help researchers connect with people with lived experience. I think about 190,000 people at one point or another participated in various studies, projects, gave in. And I think it's a model that we would hope to bring to any kind of Canadian brain initiative. What we're concerned, research is into brain conditions is very, very important, but we also realize that everything else connects with we need the research to actually make advances on medications, on treatments. But there's also a kind of research that many people don't think about when they're thinking about chronic conditions, and that's about research of life, on how people can help live better today. And so the transdisciplinary aspect of what you were talking about, Eve, makes so much sense to people who live with a neurological condition or a brain condition today, because they want solutions that are not just 20 years down the line, hopefully, but something that can help them in the immediate future.
So
actually, I would be interested, if I could actually pose a question of my own. I would actually be interested in learning from and Jan about how those initiatives are involving people with conditions with lived experience in their approaches. They just could take a few minutes to talk about that.
I could say something initially. So within the Australian Brain Alliance, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, we have sort of just over 30 organizations who contribute. And many of those, of course, are research institutions and medical research institutions, but we also have other professional societies. So for example, the Australian Psychological Society, which is the peak body in Australia. It represents something like 30,000 psychologists who are seeing people, clients in the population for a range of conditions, mental health issues, and so on. And so through a group like the Australian Psychological Society, we are able to sort of access individuals with a range of conditions who are able to tell us about their lived experiences and tell us how they would like to see research unfolding in an organization like the Australian Brain Alliance. So that's just one sort of concrete example of how we do that. I think, we could go a step further. We don't really have individual stakeholders of different patient groups, dementia groups, and other clinical groups on our working groups, but we could certainly do that. And I think it's actually a great idea that, we want to be involving those people from the very beginning of our initiative and get their perspective so that we're able to hear them and respond to them as well.
I could add to this that the European Human Brain Project has definitely activities in community engagement. and interactions with the patient organizations. We have used also representatives of patients organizations to actually get feedback on the work being done, not at least on the infrastructure developments that are taking place that we are delivering out to for general use. The reason, the motivation we have for having these interactions is to really get feedback from them, how they see what we're doing and how they can influence and set the directions as well. So those type of dialogues are very, very important in terms of also influencing political decisions on priorities in the future, of course, because we are all have a dual interest here. On the one hand, we need to take care of the basic research questions to move forwards. On the other hand, we need to listen to input and to change directions and modify directions based on what is happening in our society and where the needs are. So this is a very natural thing to embed.
And this is something that came up at that panel at the European Parliament that we had a month ago. I guess, Jan, it's the preoccupation that the patients be engaged and other communities as well. It's true that there's a lot of neurobiology focus if we look at the most of the brain initiatives, starting with the base. I wonder maybe a few thoughts on how you perceive that the Canadian initiative can be adding to this ecosystem or not, or should it or should it not, in terms of scope. I don't know if I can ask again my Canadians to start with this, or maybe just yeah, let's start there.
I think that maybe one of the things that we really bring to the table, and I'm not an expert on the Brain Initiative, is the fact that we are also have a focus on mental health research. And, I think the other initiatives are maybe more neurobiological in approach, as you were mentioning, Eve, whereas we bring to the table more than just the fundamentals, fundamental basic science, but also to include mental health research. And I think that we're not unique in this in any sort of way, but we have a Canadian flavor to this. We have stakeholders, including the Indigenous, populations, and yeah, so I think that Canada has a unique space that we can contribute to.
There's certainly a stance a position that Canada took with the creation of the Canadian Institute of Health Research at the beginning in 2000. If we compare ourselves to the Americans, where we decided to have one institute for neuroscience, mental health, and addiction, and really ensure that all these fields are connected to each other. So I think there's also perhaps Canada can continue being a champion of bringing together all of these aspects. There's definitely on the world scene a convergence of efforts to address mental health problems through a biological lens, and therefore that the fields can cross-fertilize themselves a lot, but it certainly also brings us to societal needs, for sure. I don't know if this is something. Yeah, go on. Yes.
Yeah, if I could add to the discussion, a meeting with our member organizations last week, and one of the things that we were talking about was exactly what you were saying, the need to recognize as a unit, as it were, and it's that not separating into this is neurological, this is mental health, because the crossover of having a neurological condition will have mental health implications. So there aren't firm dividing lines. So I think that that decision many years ago within CHR is a good one. And the fact that it's a Canadian brain research strategy or the initiative it just makes so much sense. People who live with brain conditions, whether they're labeled neurological from the start or whether they have mental health implications as well. So it again, I would applaud that approach, because it will, seems to me, make a lot more sense down the line than having the silos, which I think again is the breaking down of the silos and going into more collaborative approach. Hopefully will serve us all better in the end.
Maybe we can come back though. I mean, behind the all the biology and the health aspects, back to what you mentioned, Jason, as the fact that the field of neuroscience is a major driver of I mean, there's the whole area of neurotechnology, but I would argue that it's a major driver of technology development in many fronts. An easy one to see is how much neuroscience has been the inspiration behind the development of artificial intelligence. It all draws from very basic principles of understanding of how the brain works, and there's so much more that can be extracted from that. Maybe some of your thoughts, Jason, and maybe Jan, on this aspect and how this is important. I mean, Jan, you're representing the International Brain Initiative, but you're also representing the European Human Brain Project, and maybe you can tell us also a bit on your perspective there on this aspect of neuroscience as a driver for economy. Is this something really special about the field of neuroscience, and is this something that people should be really tapping in versus other fields, for example?
Yeah, that's a good point. So, well, if we take a step back and we say what are the drivers for progress, that's to some extent the same as the drivers for science and scientific progress. That comes out of ideas and paradigms, top-down or bottom-up perspectives on understanding something. It comes out of tools, software, technologies, analysis, instruments, and so on. And it comes out of organizing all of this. Because if you don't have systems for kind of taking care of the information, you're not going to benefit a lot. I would say that neuroscience and brain is the perfect field. It's not alone of being an interesting, perfect field, because there are many other fields that, of course, also are gathering lots of exciting and important information. Take, for example, in geography, you can monitor almost anything below the water or above the water, and you collect all kinds of information, and it's really critical to understand nature. It is remarkably similar to what we do in the brain. If you have a drone around the coastline and you collect information, it's like a lab collecting information from parts of the brain. You need to put it together, you need to structure it, you need to connect it. And you need to have the best players doing this. So there are all these elements involved. So studying the brain means that you really introduce new systems, new thinking. You have to develop a number of critical technologies to be able to make any sense out of it. So it is a driver for progress in many, many areas. As I think we already actually heard in several of the talks today, wonderful examples of how the brain research field connects directly to key developments. And that's because of the nature of the whole thing. It's because it deals with these complex issues and have to find smart solutions to deal with them. That's kind of my partly philosophical comment to your question.
I was just going to say, to continue with that sort of philosophical angle, we live in the information age. That's what distinguishes the time we live in now. It's all about information. If you control information, if you understand how information is passed around society and so forth, it's an incredibly important aspect. And you know, the brain, that is what the brain does. It's an information processor. It's the only biological system we know of that actually takes information from the world, transforms it in some way, and then expresses it in the form of behavior. And that behavior might be something like learning, so it might be relevant to the classroom. It might be disordered thought or behavior in the case of mental health or other psychiatric and neurological conditions. But, you know, I think what's really important is that is what the brain's for. It regulates our behavior, it processes information. And if you think about the development of computer systems, software algorithms that have transformed our lives through you know, mobile phones, and you can think of many other applications, many of those sort of software platforms were inspired by the way that the brain processes information. And AI is just the most recent sort of iteration of that process. It's taking inspiration from how we think the brain processes information, and it's applying that in silico. It's applying that in an artificial environment to try and enhance processing power. So I really do think that this is where neuroscience has had already a huge impact, and it promises to have a much larger impact in the future as well. And I think in the realm of neuroethics, is a very important part that brain initiatives can play. You know, we have Jan mentioned before, we have drones, we have autonomous systems that are allowed to do their own thing. You know, we don't fully understand how artificial systems make decisions, for example. And we need to be able to understand those things if we want to be using technologies of all sorts in an ethical way. And I think that neuroscientists and psychologists and philosophers, our colleagues in other disciplines, should be coming together to think about these important implications. We shouldn't be afraid of new technology, but we need to be very careful that we can implement technologies in an ethical way that's acceptable to our societies. And I think it's really important that this is where a national brain initiative can have an impact, bringing different discipline areas together to consider these really important issues.
So that's very interesting, Jason, this last point. And it's one thing that we can mention is that within the International Brain Initiative, the whole topic of neuroethics is something that has brought a lot of consensus as something that needs a major focus and combining efforts from between initiatives. And I would add to what you just said that it's particularly important to bring all of the players across the scale of complexity and across stakeholders around that question. And because we live in such a world of bombarded with technology, and it has to do with our brains because we're interacting with all this technology, just the media, our communications and technologies, for example. And I guess you're right. It's a great opportunity to make sure that all players are taking part into the dialogue around ethical advances in our societies around the technology. I wonder if I push you a bit further, Jan, maybe in the again in this area of technology, would you say that the European Brain Project is more focused on the neurotechnological aspect than anything else, and you know the balance between the health aspect versus the potential impact of neuroscience on technology was that more the impetus behind, or is that not fair? Oops, you're muted again.
The Human Brain Project is kind of a merger of three different initiatives, if you like, or three different aspects. So it is the basic science. It is the technology developments, where we, for example, from the beginning had neuromorphic computing as a part as well, and also with very strong representations of high performance analytics or high performance computing, and also the medical part. Now, what has brought these together is around actually organizing data, creating workflows, analytical tools around the data. So you could say, kind of starts with research, generating results, generating concrete data, organizing these data, moving that into the domain of building models and performing simulations, and ultimately also emulations, which then are built into neuromorphic computing devices, and towards robotics, which is kind of an extended simulation, the virtual robotics, which we also have. So we have this continuum from research, including basic research, all the way through to end up in neurobotics and neuromorphic computing. That's the way the HPP has been constructed. So you can ask, where are we heading? Well, all of these aspects will for sure continue. They will not continue in one project. That's not likely at the moment, but they will continue in different types of projects. Our legacy, as it seems at the moment, is focusing on the research infrastructure we are developing, which is a key part, and that brings together these different aspects. So all these aspects are built into this infrastructure at this point in time, being presented as what we refer to as eBrains, available at ebrains.eu, which is going to grow tremendously now with the next couple of years, and also there are mechanisms to make it sustainable and continue. So that's the approach we are taking. But if you're pushing me regarding exactly where we are with regard to these three aspects, that's a little bit difficult to answer in a simple way, because they will definitely continue in Europe, but not necessarily within one project.
But maybe I'd like you to hear you more on this issue of infrastructure, though, because I think that's a very interesting concept. That there are lots of strengths. We're moving, and I think all of the brain initiatives around the world are about big science, moving these fields of science into a big science approach. So we have all these strengths that we've talked about, and Canada has, Shana's outlined all of the strengths that we have, and you summarized some of them, Jan, yourself. I guess one could argue that one place to multiply the impact of this, or even enable some of the ambitions that we have for advancing our understanding of the brain, is through the infrastructure. And I think this has been your experience in the European setting. Yeah,
I think it is an important point. There are of course several aspects related to research infrastructure. You have physical instruments and facilities which are needed. I mean, if we compare for a moment ourselves with astronomy, you have a few installations, and the only way to get anything done is to have those few, because nobody wants to have their own telescope. Now, we have lots of instruments. They're also getting more and more expensive, so you need to organize these things well in order to be efficient. But we're still very, very distributed. So therefore comes the other aspect of an infrastructure, which is challenging for us. Again, comparing with astronomy, how do they deal with what they find, what they observe, what they collect? You can't have these expenses getting all those data out there immediately. Complete waste. So they collect data through a few instruments, they organize these data and get them out immediately. We are not there in neuroscience. But the point is that we are improving on actually simply being competitive. There is no scientific field in the future that, in my view, can be competitive unless it organizes its data in such a way that you can actually look into the data and therefore have some reproducibility opportunity because the data is there, and also have metadata or information around those data, giving you the chance to have replicable research. And this is where there's a really a huge still work to be done in neuroscience. And these things, I think, really requires brain initiatives, requires an additional focus on convergence. Because if you don't create that, the drivers for these changes will not be strong enough, in my view. So that's the other infrastructure. That's the digital research infrastructure. which you need to organize data to be able to efficiently work with data. And data is not just there, it's connected to workflows, analysis, analytics. And these are aspects that I think are very important, and I'm confident that on the Canadian side, you are already doing this.
But maybe push you more on this, and why neuroscience? Why specifically for neuroscience is this particularly needed, or a particularly interesting opportunity?
Well, my perspective in all parts of science. I also think that, well, actually, the fact that Canada is doing very well in neuroscience today illustrates that you need to do exactly this. You can't continue doing very well unless you do something with the way you do the science, is my perspective. So this is a component that's probably you have, but I think you would benefit tremendously from strengthening. And this is ultimately how we also need to work with solving problems around the world. Because take an example, we are collecting data on in different countries around the world. A lot of duplications. I don't think there's anything wrong with duplications. But the point is that you can get a lot more out if you're able to combine really critical data. Talking, for example, to research on diseases, discovering what you need to find in terms of biomarkers and in terms of seeing what is working and not working on therapies, you need a lot of data. And then you need to combine these data. This also applies to basic science type of questions. And this is one aspect, and this is also why the data standards, data sharing, data governance is such a key point or key area in the International BRAIN Initiative. And I really believe that BRAIN initiatives are needed to drive this, because if things are doing well, doing fine, but business as usual, it looks good now, but it won't be competitive in a few years from now. So this is therefore critical to, I would say, to make sure you really can build on the strong science you're doing in Canada today. Some dimensions need to be added, stronger than they are today. They are there today, but need to be added in a strong way. So I think this would be my perspective on the importance of one of the important aspects of creating a strong Canadian BRAIN initiative.
Add to that, I think neuroscience has a particular challenge around data, because the discipline by its very nature operates at many different levels of analysis and explanation. And so there are neuroscientists who, are molecular biologists. They're looking at the movement, transport of molecules within individual nerve cells, for example. Then you have, physiologists who are working at just the connections between individual cells. And then we go up another level and look at small circuits in the brain. And then we go up to the whole brain. And of course, then we go beyond to behavior, the expression of brain activity in behavior. Those multiple levels are all generating vast amounts of data. And one of the reasons that in Australia we chose that mission statement of cracking the brain's code is that what that really means is that we don't have a good understanding of how to relate the data at one level to the data at another level. If you work as a molecular biologist, your discoveries, incredibly important discoveries, it's not clear how they necessarily will change or regulate activity at the level of a circuit in the brain. And from a small circuit, it's not clear how that then moves up to the level of a system and so on. And so asking this broader question, why would you bring a national initiative together? Why would you bring neuroscientists together? I think the very reason is you need to get those levels integrated with each other, and you need to have scientists working at those different levels, bringing their data together to try and crack that code. How do you relate what's happening at the level of a molecule or a cell or a circuit in the brain all the way up to the level of behavior? Because as a society, it's that level that we kind of care about. What do people do? How do they feel? What are their emotions? How do they think? All of these things, I think that's why we need to have these national and international brain initiatives to bring those people together to ask those really big kind of challenging questions. In genetics, it's a complicated field, but we know the code, right? We have kind of 4 base pairs and different combinations, and I'm not trying to belittle that field, but in brain science, we don't even know the code. We don't even have the alphabet to understand how things relate to each other. That's why you need big initiatives bringing large numbers of scientists in this field together.
Great. That's something that's actually captured in the statement that we made of bridging between scales of complexity. As you said, there's a lot of knowledge and strength in each of these layers. Behavior, and from circuit to and behavior and some molecular aspects and so on. But how you go from one layer to the next, as you said, is really a major challenge. And again, I think the Canadian scene could be a great place to be able to crack how these things translate across these scales. One question we have in the audience is, okay, so what's standing in the way of getting this done? Getting a Canadian brain initiative. Of course, well, Jan, you can speak about the major investment that was made in Europe to strike the Human Brain Project, and we certainly know the size of the investment in the U.S., which at maturity will probably be in the range of the $100 billion by maturity of the project. But maybe I can add to this the underlying question of who should be investing. Is it something that should be invested by the public? Is it a public investment that should be made for a brain initiative, or at other levels? Of course, there are many things that need to be done on the way in terms of rallying all the stakeholders among common vision and so on. But at some point, we just need to jump in and make the investment. Maybe some thoughts on why why should it be a public investment, an investment of the public sector? I mean, and maybe for Jan and Jason after your perspective on that, on how you manage to, or your plan to manage to convince government to invest, or what you think has convinced them. But maybe our Canadian
comment on what.
Oh, okay, go ahead, Jan. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I could just give a comment on how the HBP came about and where it is kind of placed in the European landscape. So the Human Brain Project came out of what's called Future Emerging Technologies Program. This actually speaks a little bit to how you would see this project, FET, Future Emerging Technologies. And it came out of essentially ICT. So it's not been competing with neuroscience funding. But the brain was seen as a key driver for these type of investments in those areas. So if you look at the European landscape of neuroscience, brain research investments, and the Human Brain Project is just a part of that, but it's a very big project. And there's a lot of other projects. So we are then referred to as the initiative representing Europe. So the different ways of doing this. You can either look at everything going on, or you could focus on some project which covers some kind of dimension, which is of interest for the remaining players of the other projects. For example, we're creating an infrastructure that is of use for all types of brain projects. That's how it works on our side now. None of these projects are exactly identical, so this is about finding out what's making most sense in your case in Canada.
So that definitely speaks to the impact of neuroscience on technology development. If the field of information technology said, for us to move forward, we need to invest in neuroscience, that's a very eloquent demonstration of that. What about this is one of those very large European funding scheme. How much is the private sector investment? Is it 100% public funding?
It is close to public funding 100%. It's composed of a European Commission part, and it's composed on what one could refer to as in-kind contributions, national contributions. European landscape has kind of two, well, of course, several components, but there is a European funding scheme under the European Union, and there are national funding schemes. So you find different levels of funding, so to speak, but we are on the public side, almost all of what you find in our project.
So I don't know, maybe Diana, you could say something about NHCC's perspective on this, because I think NHCC has, you have, as you said, led many reports, evaluations of the landscape, of what's at stake, and so on. And perhaps the patients have also something to say about whether who should be investing in such an initiative.
Yeah, I think the big people who are living with a brain condition and their families and caregivers, I should add, it's when one has a chronic condition, most of the neurological conditions certainly fall into that. It's more than just that one person. It affects the entire family, and in fact, serves to an immense degree as well. I think what is, I mean, obviously everyone recognizes that more research is needed to get conditions, get diseases, disorders to the point in which they're much more, they're very few neurological conditions have treatments that do more than just ameliorate symptoms or perhaps help to some extent, but there's certainly, I think we cannot really talk about cures in any sense. So obviously research into finding what causes in the instance of an injury, like a brain injury, are really important. But as I mentioned, I think what people really are interested in is how can they also live better today. And I think there's other aspects of the research field that goes beyond, and not to denigrate this, beyond the molecules and the connections. It's the pieces of, it's the parts that talk about how the sort of the applied part of research. And I think to me, about the Canadian Brain Research Strategy work to date is that it recognizes that research and researchers can take many different forms, and that the bringing together of scientists and people with and other kind of stakeholders, I think is really important to the success of it in terms of eventual success. I mean, when I look at the slide in which you list the different aspects of CBRS, the couple that leap out at me are the transdisciplinary aspect of it, the one that speaks to diversity in terms of both of those who are involved in doing the research, but also those who would benefit from it, and as well as neuroethics. So to me, that's I think the way that the strategy is being put together is really important because it does recognize the very human element. And I'm hopefully, as it goes along, that it'll continue to keep that in mind, because I mean, I realize that data and big data are really important, but I think it has to, as we go forward, we also have to keep saying, well, how does this actually affect the people who have the injuries, have the diseases, are living with the disorders every day of their lives? So I hope that will I think the underpinnings are there. So I'm really happy to contribute to moving this forward. And I hope convincing governments that this is a really important thing, that there should be Canadian investment in it, not just for that it will boost Canadian research and Canadian science, but that it will benefit are living with a wide variety of neurological conditions right now.
Maybe another, oops.
I was just going to add, Eve, if I may,
Yeah.
just to come back again to the question in the chat about what's standing in the way of forming an initiative in Canada. And I can talk to the Australian experience because we have an Australian Brain Alliance, of course, but we don't have an initiative that's funded. That's one of our key goals, is to get central funding from government. And I would say that we've noticed sort of I've noticed two factors at play here that are potential barriers. One of them is kind of intrinsic, and the other one I would call more extrinsic. The intrinsic one is you need to develop a sense of pulling in the same direction amongst those involved in your alliance. So, you know, in science, often the part of our training is that it's partly a competitive process. You know, we're competing for grant funding and we're competing for publishing our work in the best journals and so on. But one needs to adopt a much more cooperative mindset if you want to have something, you know, where the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts. So that's one of the intrinsic factors, is developing a dialogue and building trust amongst the individuals, the stakeholders, the neuroscientists and the other stakeholders. And then I would say the kind of extrinsic factor is how does the government respond to what you're asking for? And Jan gave a very nice example of the astronomers. I would add to that the physicists, you know, that Large Hadron Colliders and things. You don't have one of those in every country, you just get one. And so when you go to government, they're naturally ultimately responsible for distributing public money. You know, we pay our tax and they have to distribute the money in the way that they think is best, one would hope. And so going to government, I think the challenge is to highlight for them that what neuroscience has to contribute goes beyond health. Health is a kind of core platform. And then beyond health, we have things to say about education, about the development of technologies, about artificial intelligence, making contact with the defense sector. And when we went to government, what we found the most challenging is that as soon as our ask went beyond the portfolio of the particular member of parliament, you know, let's say we were talking to the education minister, they would say, well, neuroscience, isn't that a health thing? And then when you went to talk to the health minister, they would say, well, we give a lot of money for health already. You know, why should we give more to neuroscience? Don't we already fund dementia research? And so, you know, it was that fragmentation that you need to go with one message, and you need to be able to appeal to a government en masse with a coherent message that potentially cuts across the traditional silos of the way that, at least in Australia, our parliament works. So I think to come back to that question, what are the things that get in the way of forming an initiative? I would say there's the internal factors, and then there are those projecting out into the public domain and the government. They're two key barriers that we need to be able to deal with and get through.
So perhaps we could say, oh, sorry.
I was going to say, like, if I may, I'd like to actually pose a question to you. I know that you're the chair, but you have a unique position as the person who's been spearheading this initiative in Canada. And it'd be really great to hear some of the barriers or having this question put back to you.
Well, I'd like to continue on what Jason said, and I think this fits with the perhaps the bug, if you want, is the feature, the fact that neuroscience spans so broadly, you know, across all sectors, as you said, you know, from science to medicine to society. That's one reason why we need an initiative, because we can't just, I mean, it's true that the Europeans were able to get the infusion from the ICT sector, who was the information technology sector, and thank you for their vision as to saying we need to invest in neuroscience. But at the same time, it's only one aspect of it, of the impact of neuroscience. I think the ambition in Canada is to to really be encompassing, again, because as Jason said, neuroscience spans everything all the way down to education, to the way we structure our society and so on. And we're really hoping that the knowledge can be inspiring the society on all levels. People have used the term, a neuroscience-driven nation. Can we have a nation that is guided by principles derived from scientific findings? So the fact that it's so broad with this, and that we want to be really encompassing to really make a difference in the field, makes it a challenge to have a concerted funding effort. And I guess that's why there is a need for a brain initiative that transcends individual ministries, if we want. But the other aspect that I perhaps can add also is, and we've mentioned it a few times in the field of neuroscience, especially if, there's the health aspect, but there's the technology driver. There's the need for this major infrastructure to be able to support that. And we have the ambition of that infrastructure to be very open. And those two things require a lot of investment. It's a very costly ambition to have an open science effort and to make information available so that all stakeholders or all players can really capitalize on that information and multiply its impact. The infrastructure at the base of that is a very costly one. And I think it's something that has to be funded by the public sector, because it has to be open, it has to be maintained, and it has to be done in a way that the public and the patients will trust it. And so if we want it to remain open and follow the proper good practices and so on, and we want people to really trust it, as I said, it has to be publicly funded. So it has to be publicly funded, but I think it needs a special initiative, dedicated initiative. Otherwise, we'll just end up exactly as Jason said. Everyone will just be seeing its own silo of the overall picture, and then obviously you miss it, because it's only, as we've said before. You talked about we've talked about levels of complexity. There are things. The whole idea of complex systems is that there are things you can achieve at each level of complexity that you cannot achieve by the sum of the parts, of the individual parts at the other level. It's only when you bring these things together and you have the right dynamic that you can actually achieve certain things, you open new perspectives. So that's why it needs to be supported so broadly and not just through one silo. But that's my perspective. Shanaz, you also represent the Canadian neuroscience, the scientists, the neuroscientists themselves. Maybe some ideas about what you think that this community would like to see as blue skying, and you've been involved also in advocating to the government and so on. I don't know if you have some more thoughts on that.
Well, just one more thought on the open neuroscience aspect of things. That's like a really big push, as you were mentioning, from starting off from McGill with the Tannenbaum Institute, and this is being adopted in a number of different places across Canada. There seems to be a real desire to have this kind of open neuroscience push across Canada, and I think the CBRS would really work very well, or the Brain Initiative would work really well with this kind of open neuroscience type work.
Yeah, again, just to put in perspective, CBRS is really just a group of people that are trying to advocate for this and provide a vision or a path towards a Brain Initiative, but we are not the Brain Initiative, and we're not going to be the holder of that Brain Initiative. It has to belong to all sectors. And as I said at the beginning, our vision is that we just want to inspire government to make that investment, to really capitalize on the great strength that we have in Canada and by putting it together, by bridging, wiring, if we want, all of these strengths in Canada together, we really think that we can multiply our national impact and the return for the population. But that can be done through the government's own channels. So thank you very much for your time. Jason is waking up in Australia. Jan is almost midnight in Europe. I really thank you very much. I think it represents also the beauty of international efforts and the aspirations of the neuroscientists to really work together. Let's hope this discussion can inspire our policy interested people to push further the discussion and see how we can translate all this for our fellow citizens. Thank you very much, everyone, and good day and good night for some of you.
Thank you, Yves.